Imagine being a little child. You're woken up in the dead of night by panicked voices and the distant sound of screaming. The floor beneath you tilts as cold water seeps in, and the once grand ship begins its slow, merciless descent into the freezing Atlantic. As chaos erupts around you, hands pull you through the crowd, lifeboats fill up, you don't know where your mother is, and suddenly you're drifting away, watching the mighty ship vanish into the darkness. Hey y'all, I'm Christina, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. On April 10th, 1912, the majestic RMS Titanic steamship set off on her maiden voyage from Southampton, England, bound for New York, with more than 2,200 passengers and crew members on board. She stopped in Cherbourg, France, and Queensland, Ireland, before heading out into the Atlantic. 4 days into the crossing, at 11:40 p.m., the ship struck an iceberg, and less than 3 hours later, at 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, she sank. While many of the exact details are still debated to this very day, of the roughly 2,200 people on board, it's estimated that about 1,500 people lost their lives, with only a little over 700 surviving. Roughly 80 of those survivors were children. While there have certainly been worse peacetime tragedies at sea, none have captivated the public's imagination quite like the sinking of the RMS Titanic. Over the years, countless books and articles have examined every conceivable angle of the tragedy. Movies have recreated gripping scenes from that fateful night, and entire museums have been built dedicated solely to the ship and its passengers. Built to carry more than 3,500 souls between the passengers and the crew, the Titanic featured 10 decks, was 883 feet long, which is about 3 football fields long, and was 92 feet and 6 inches wide at its widest point. Now, this doesn't even hold a candle to modern-day cruise ships, which are more than 5 times the size of the Titanic, but at that time, she was really impressive. This was the largest passenger ship that had ever been built to this point, and she was fast, reaching speeds of up to 23 knots or 26 miles per hour, which of course, again, doesn't sound fast to us these days, but that speed meant that she could cross the Atlantic in only a week. The first ever plane to have flown from coast to coast had only accomplished that feat within the last 5 months, and even that took 84 days. So travel was definitely a totally different thing than it is today. So you have to look at how much slower forms of travel were back then to truly understand how impressive the Titanic was in its day. And in addition to the impressive mechanics, the luxury of the Titanic was also unmatched. In a time when most people were still heating their homes with gas lanterns, the Titanic had electric lights in all of her cabins. Now, also during this time period, most homes didn't yet have telephones, so the majority of people were still having to write letters to communicate or go down to their local telegraph office to send a message. But the Titanic was equipped with a wireless radio that could transmit messages up to 1,200 miles away and had a 50 telephone switchboard. There was also a state-of-the-art hospital, 4 elevators, a heated swimming pool, a fully equipped gym, a regulation squash court, and even a Turkish bath, which is basically a fancy sauna. There was a dark room for amateur photographers. There were gourmet restaurants, barbershops, libraries, and lounges, and even the bathrooms were classy. They were adorned with ornate wood-carved paneling, elaborate glassed domes, beautiful works of art, and the finest of furnishings. And the cabins aboard the Titanic were just as good, if not better, than most luxury hotels back in that era. This place was basically its own little city. The best way you could probably equate this is if you've ever been on a modern day cruise ship, which of course they're bigger and grander now, but the way you felt the first time you stepped onto one or you saw one, I've personally never been on one. I've only seen them in pictures, but these things are gigantic. And that's how people felt at the time about the Titanic. This ship was the very first of its kind. There was nothing else like this yet, and people were excited. A major publication had called the Titanic practically unsinkable, and by the time she was ready to set sail, the general public had just dropped the whole practically part, and they believed this ship was truly unsinkable. Now, another aspect that made the Titanic so intriguing were the passengers themselves. They were from all over the world. Half of the passengers were British, American, and Irish, but the rest came from over 24 other countries, and they spanned across all social classes. In first class, you had wealthy businessmen, industrialists, and upper crust families, many of whom were returning from vacations in Europe. Second class was made up mostly of young professionals and tradesmen who were seeking their fortunes in America. And the third class quarters were made up of mostly poor immigrants who were seeking a better life in the New World. This ship was transporting more than just people. She was carrying hopes and dreams, which made it all the more tragic when on Sunday, April 14th, her starboard side brushed against an iceberg and began taking on water. Immediately upon inspection, the crew determined that the boat would sink in only a few short hours. And at 12:05 a.m., just 20 minutes after the collision, Captain Edward J. Smith ordered crew to prepare the lifeboats and start waking up the passengers. It was time to abandon ship. For all her beauty and majesty, the RMS Titanic's biggest flaw was that she was lacking one critical necessity, and that is she did not have enough lifeboats for all of the people on board. She carried 14 standard-sized lifeboats, 2 smaller emergency boats, and 4 collapsible boats that had pull-up canvas sides. Filled to capacity, these boats would have only held a little over half of the people on board, or roughly 1,178 people. Yet, these 20 lifeboats were more than the British Board of Trade regulations required for ships to carry at that time. So, the Titanic actually exceeded regulations. While the crew were preparing the lifeboats, the wireless operator was sending out calls for help. But the nearest vessel was more than 4 hours away. Now, that is what is typically reported, but just a little interesting side note here. There was another ship that was pretty close to the Titanic. It said that it was actually visible from the naked eye off in the horizon from like the deck of the Titanic. This was the SS California. Now, there is quite a bit of debate as to whether this ship could have saved the Titanic or not due to a lot of complicated situations with icebergs and all of those things. This ship was mostly for freight and only sometimes carried passengers, so we won't get into all of that now. Just wanted to say that could have possibly changed this whole situation. The call went out for women and children first, and crew members began loading women and children into lifeboats along with a few men to handle the oars. Husbands and fathers kissed their wives and children before placing them in the boats and waving goodbye. Money and clout meant nothing when it came to evacuating. First-class women wrapped in their furs sat next to poverty-stricken immigrants in their night clothes. There was no discrimination with who was allowed onto the boats, except when it came to men. While some boats allowed men to climb aboard if there was room and there were no women or children nearby, the crew members that were manning other boats would not allow male passengers onto the boats at all, sometimes even firing warning shots when men tried to climb aboard. Even if there were no additional women and children nearby and the boats were being lowered into the ocean half empty. In fact, many of the lifeboats were launched only half full. The crew was in a rush because they wanted to give as many lifeboats as possible the time to row away before they got caught in the suction of the sinking ship. By 2 a.m., the bow of the ship was fully submerged and the stern was completely out of the water. The vessel was angling downward so steeply that streaming people were sliding, falling, or jumping into the icy water. There was a loud bang as everything that was not bolted down, like grand pianos, tables, chairs, and dishes, all crashed forward. And then everything that was bolted down followed suit, like the ship's boilers and the newfangled ice-making machines. The Titanic let out a stutter, there were a few muffled explosions, and then, with a loud crack, she split into 2 pieces. The bow sunk quickly while the stern rose to a full vertical position as passengers clung to anything they could, before the stern also began to plunge, picking up speed as it sank downward beneath the surface. There were countless people left in the ocean trying to tread the frigid water, pleading for help. Unfortunately, very few of the lifeboats had the courage to come to their aid for fear of being capsized or swamped. And so, the estimated 1,500 souls took their last breath, one by one, most dying from hypothermia due to the extreme coldness of the Atlantic. Shortly after 4 a.m., those lucky enough to have made it on a lifeboat were picked up by the RMS Carpathia. The wealthy lost their valuables and money. The poor lost everything they had. But worst of all, most lost their husbands and fathers. Eventually, 333 bodies were pulled from the water, but the rest were never recovered. While no one's class was taken into consideration when they were being placed on the boats, those in the first and second classes definitely had easier access to get onto the lifeboats, which meant that more than 60% of those in first class and 42% from second class were rescued, while in third class, that number was only 25%. Only 24% of the crew survived, and while 75% of the women survived, only 20% of men made it out alive. And while preference was given to children, less than half of the children on board survived, which is possibly due to the fact that the majority of children on board were in the third class areas. Of the 185 children passengers on board, which are classified as those 17 and younger, only 86 survived. In first class, there were 13 children. 11 of those survived. There were 34 in second class, of which 30 survived. And in third class, there were 134 children, of which only 44 made it out alive. There were some entire families who perished together in the crash, with the youngest victim being just 4 months old. Of the 18 teenagers who were working on the crew as bellboys and assistants in the kitchen, only 1 of them survived. 17-year-old assistant cook John Collins was swept overboard just moments before the ship went down. He was trying to save an infant, but lost the baby in the water. Still, he was able to swim and reached an overturned lifeboat, where he and several others were able to cling onto the hull of the overturned boat all night until help arrived. Now, in general, teenage boys were kind of treated as if they were already adults, so the only ones who survived were those who seemed to have gotten super lucky. John Thayer, who went by Jack, was one of those lucky ones. He too was 17 years old and was traveling on the Titanic with his parents. He had become separated from his family at the time of the evacuation, but being that he was 17 years old and considered practically a man, he and his friend were not allowed onto a lifeboat. Ultimately, after the last boat had left and the Titanic was sinking, the 2 teens decided to jump. Jack was wearing a life vest, but was still almost sucked under from the suction of the Titanic sinking. He fought his hardest and was able to get his head above the water, and by what seemed to be pure luck, he surfaced right next to an upside-down, collapsible lifeboat. Someone was brave enough to give him a hand and pull him up, and this is where he and 28 others, including John Collins, clung to the hull until help arrived the next morning. Jack never saw the friend he jumped with or his father ever again, but he was reunited with his mother until her death at the age of 71, when she passed away on the 32nd anniversary of the Titanic's sinking. Now, in what seems like some kind of cosmic coincidence, there were actually quite a few of the Titanic survivors who passed away on the Titanic's anniversary throughout the years that followed. Another lucky teen was August Abrahamsson. He was a 19-year-old third-class passenger who was traveling with his parents and two siblings. Now, August's lack of response to the crash may just have been what saved his life. He didn't believe that there was anything wrong with the ship, so he stayed in his room long after people had been evacuating. And when he finally arrived on the deck, most of the lifeboats were already gone. He made his way to the front of the ship, where he was able to board the very last lifeboat before it launched, which, if it had not been the very last lifeboat, they probably would not have allowed a 19-year-old boy to get on. As the boat pulled away, August heard muffled explosions and saw the ship sink. 12-year-old Bertha felt bad for the little motherless boy who stood crying on the deck of the Carpathia. Surrounded by women speaking English to him, he kept blurting out words in French and then continuing to cry. During the Titanic's voyage, she had often seen the rosy-cheeked, curly-haired little boy playing on the deck with his older brother. Because of their appearance, some of the women had called the little boys real-life cupids, and Bertha had even played with the young boys on occasion. She knew the boy, whose nickname was Moman, to be only 2 years old, and then he had a 3-year-old brother who went by Lola. She also knew that the two boys had been traveling with their father, Louis Hoffman, who was a widower. Walking over to the group of women, Bertha explained that she knew this little boy, but that he only spoke French. Now, even though she only spoke English, she started trying to talk to the little boy, thinking that maybe if he saw a familiar face, he would be more comfortable. And so she asked him, "Where's your father? Where's Lola?" But this only brought a fresh new onslaught of tears from the little boy. When the women began searching for someone who could speak French to the little boy, it was discovered that a French-speaking woman was caring for the older brother, Lola, in her room, and the two brothers were reunited. Because the boys were now believed to be parentless, when the Titanic survivors arrived in New York, the press took photos of them and printed them in the newspapers. The boys were dubbed the Titanic Orphans, Orphans of the Deep, or the Titanic Tots by various publications. The hope was that they would be able to find a living relative to take the children in. One of the first-class passengers who spoke French was a woman by the name of Margaret Hayes, and she came forward and agreed to care for the two boys in her home until a relative could be located. The boys had been identified by various nicknames, and those were printed along with photos of the boys in newspapers worldwide. When the boys' pictures were printed in French newspapers, their distraught mother, who was in fact very much alive, saw their pictures and rushed to New York to collect her children. It turns out that the boys' parents were separated and the courts had granted custody to the mother. But when they were allowed to see their father on Easter Sunday of 1912, he took the boys and ran. Distraught over his failed marriage and losing custody of his boys, a bankrupted Michel Navratil decided to run from it all, boarding the Titanic in Southampton, England, with his two toddler sons, whose real names were Michel Jr. and Edmund. He used a stolen passport to assume the identity of Mr. Louis M. Hoffman, and he called his sons John and Fred. And as he began to meet other second-class passengers, he told them that he was a widower. He kept a close eye on his boys, only allowing them out of his sight once when he allowed a French-speaking woman to watch them for a few hours while he played cards. On the night of the collision, Navratil woke his sons, dressed them warmly, and took them to the deck where crew members had locked arms around the last remaining lifeboat so that only women and children were allowed through. Navratil handed the boys through the ring of men, and as he placed his sons in the care of strangers, Navratil told his little 3-year-old son, Michel Jr., "My child, when your mother comes for you, as she surely will, tell her I loved her dearly and still do." While Edmund was sobbing, Michel Jr. doesn't remember feeling frightened. He just remembered the pleasure of going plop into the lifeboat. Still, he credits his brush with death and losing his father at a very young age as having affected his thought processes all throughout his life. When the rescue boat arrived, the boys were hoisted from the lifeboats onto its deck in burlap sacks. Their mother arrived in New York on May 16, 1912, and if there were any doubt that she was in fact the boys' mother, it was immediately put to rest by the toddlers' reactions to seeing her, crying and holding out their arms to their mama. Once reunited, the family returned to France. Michel Jr. and Edmund were the only children who were rescued without a parent or guardian. And later in life, Michel was one of only 2 Titanic survivors who were known to have seen the 1997 Titanic film. Now, when the film was released, there were about 7 total survivors that were still alive, but the remaining 5 were unable to watch the film either due to physical or emotional reasons. Unlike the other survivor who went to the premiere and met with the director, Michel chose to watch the film at home. His daughter recalled that he had been moved by the film. He enjoyed seeing the ship race through the ocean and break the waves the way that he remembered seeing it as a child. And when he saw the scene that depicted passengers freezing to death in the icy waters, he stated that he hoped his own father had not suffered for too long before dying. Michel lived to the age of 92 and was the last living male survivor. The idea that anything could go wrong never crossed Edith Brown's mind. The 15-year-old South African girl had left her home in Cape Town to start a new life in Seattle, Washington. Her 60-year-old father, Thomas, was a well-respected investor and owned several hotels in South Africa. His sweet-natured wife, Elizabeth, was 20 years younger, and the two doted on Edith. Even more so since her younger sister Dorothy had died in 1908 from diphtheria. Edith received the best education and often traveled with her parents to London to shop for clothes for the family and fixtures for the Thomases' hotels. Her mother Elizabeth had a sister who lived in Seattle and had encouraged the Browns to come open a hotel there. In February of 1912, the family sailed to England and spent several weeks in London, where Thomas purchased lots of items for his hotels, such as linens and china and other furnishings. He then booked second-class tickets on the Titanic for himself and his family and arranged for all of the items he had purchased to be shipped in the cargo hold on their way to their new home in America. Edith and Elizabeth spent their weeks sightseeing and buying up all the latest fashions. They bought wool coats with velvet cuffs, feathered and wide-brim hats, and button-up leather boots. Thomas had a leather Gladstone bag, which was a cross between a small suitcase and a large briefcase. And this is what he used to put all of their valuables in for the journey. Things like cash, jewelry, gold coins, and their important documents. Thomas also wore a money belt that hid cash in a concealed compartment, and he had gold coins sewn into his formal vest as well as into the hems of Edith and Elizabeth's jackets. Back in those days, this was considered the safest way to travel with money. Elizabeth remembers the excitement that she and her family felt in anticipation of the journey and their new lives in America. When she caught her first glimpse of the Titanic, she marveled at how big and beautiful it was. But by the 3rd day of the voyage, disturbing things started to happen. Edith and her mother, Elizabeth, were reading in a second-class library when a middle-aged woman came over and struck up a conversation with Elizabeth. Edith continued to read until she heard the woman mention that she had found the ship very unsettling. Elizabeth was already known to have a pretty nervous personality, and the stranger's words immediately put her on edge. "In what way?" she asked, anxiously glancing at Edith. Quite frankly, I can't put my finger on it, but when we made our first stop in Queenstown, I kind of felt panicky and I wanted my husband to cancel the remainder of our voyage and get me off. The woman went on to say that she and her husband had crossed the Atlantic several times before, and this was the first time that she had ever felt this tense. She said that since she had been on the ship, she had not slept a wink. Knowing how easy it was for her to become jittery, Elizabeth decided that she better end the conversation with this woman, and so she just kind of told the woman that she hoped she was able to get some sleep soon, and they kind of just excused themselves. Now, while Elizabeth tried to brush off this interaction, it immediately made Edith feel a little uneasy because it made her think of what had happened to her father, Thomas, when they were walking down the gangway boarding the Titanic. Thomas had suddenly felt faint, his legs had started to buckle, and he had to grab the railing to keep from falling down. Thomas was shaking and he was pale as a ghost. But he had simply taken a few deep breaths and waited for it to pass, and then the family continued on to the ship. Edith hadn't thought a whole lot about it until now. Mom, do you think what happened to Father when he boarded had anything to do with a premonition like this lady had? I shouldn't tell you this because I don't want you to worry, Elizabeth said, tapping her fingers on her book. But your father admitted to me that he was overcome with the feeling that something bad was going to happen. I wonder now if we should be worried. Edith shook her head. Nothing is going to happen, Mother. This ship is unsinkable. But while she reassured her mother, Edith remembered that the Titanic had almost collided with another ship on the day of the departure. How Father had muttered to himself that was a bad omen. And the fact that the Titanic had left behind schedule was also a sign of bad luck in Thomas's eyes. Now, at the time, Edith had excused all of this away because of her father's family history. Years ago, Thomas's brother had lost his life when the ship that he was captaining had sank at sea. But now, after these strange occurrences in the library, Edith was wondering if there was more to all of this, as more and more memories began flooding to her. Because also on the day of the departure, there was a lady who was telling people's fortunes by reading tea leaves, and she had declared it was really strange because all she could see was a blank wall and nothing beyond it. The next day, Edith was lounging on the deck with her parents when Captain Edward John Smith stopped to chat with them. She remembers how regal he looked in his navy blue jacket adorned with 4 gold rings around each cuff, his sharply creased navy blue pants, and his black patent leather shoes. Are you enjoying the voyage? He asked them with a smile. It is a most pleasurable experience, Thomas answered. The captain stroked his white beard and turned to Edith. And how about you, young lady? It's the best ship I've ever been on, Edith gushed. Well, I'm glad to hear that, he chuckled. Father then asked if the ship was running on schedule, and Captain Smith said that they were making really good time thanks to the excellent weather they had been having. He went on to say that the temperature would likely drop over the next few days, but that wouldn't have any effect on them arriving in New York on time. He bid them goodbye with a pleasant smile and a half salute before walking off to talk with other passengers. The next day was Sunday, so the Browns attended church services before braving the decks for a quick stroll, as the weather had already turned quite cold. That night, they had dinner with the Reverend Carter and his wife, who were on a once-in-a-lifetime adventure to visit America for the first time, thanks to years of saving and donations from generous parishioners. After dinner, Reverend Carter led the group in hymns, but the one that stuck out in Edith's memory was For Those in Peril on the Sea. At 10 p.m., Thomas escorted his wife and daughter to their room before heading to the smoking lounge. Edith and Elizabeth were fast asleep when they were wakened by a shudder and several bumps at 11:40 p.m. Edith quickly jumped from her bed and stuck her head out of the porthole. Was the reflection of the lights from the ship dancing over the calm sea. What was that all about? Elizabeth wondered as the vibrations and engines stopped. Edith commented on how quiet it was. Suddenly, there was a knock on their door. It was Thomas. He told them that the ship had been struck by an iceberg. Thomas encouraged his family not to worry, but to be prepared by putting on warm clothes and their life vests. Both women donned warm jumpers and their new top coats. Thomas helped them put on the bulky life vest that hung over the shoulders and tied at the waist. Edith giggled. Oh, Mother, look at us. We're so fat. Elizabeth, who was feeling very nervous by this point, didn't laugh. She wanted to know where Thomas's life vest was. Thomas brushed her off, saying he would find one later. He just needed to get them to the boat deck. As they made their way up, they passed stewards who were going up and down hallways, knocking on doors, telling people to get up and put on their life vests. When they arrived next to lifeboat number 14, it was still covered and fastened on the divots. Other passengers were walking around, some in only their night clothes, others in formal wear. Some were joking and laughing, while others were fretting. Elizabeth was one of the ones who was fretting. Edith was cold, and she just wanted to go back to their cabin. Her father told her to be patient and that it wouldn't be long before he'd be tucking the two of them back into their beds. But Edith noticed that he didn't look her in the eye when he said it. It wasn't long before seamen started preparing the lifeboats for launching. Officers were yelling at their crew to get a move on, and Edith curled both of her arms around her father's arm as people began getting into the boats. The ship had built up a lot of steam before the collision, and it had to be released to prevent the boilers from exploding. So there was also the noise of the steam blasting in a constant ear-shattering volume. No one could hear anything. Officers and crew members were communicating mostly with hand signals as they helped passengers onto the boats. Many people cowered in fear, worried that the ship was about to explode. Elizabeth clutched Thomas's hand and burst into tears. After about a half hour, around 1 a.m., the steam finally began to diminish and people were once again able to hear each other. The ship's band had moved from the first-class lounge to the boat deck and were playing the most popular waltzes and ragtime tunes of the day to try and help keep the passengers' spirits up. The officer yelled for women and children first and for the rest to step back. Men pushed their loved ones forward, hoping for them to be next in line. Elizabeth immediately recognized that there weren't enough lifeboats to fit everyone, but Thomas reassured her that you'd be surprised at how many people these boats could handle. Edith knew that her father was lying, just trying to calm her mother's nerves. Edith had done the math. There were only 20 lifeboats that could each fit about 65 people. At best, a little over half could fit. Her mother was right, and this frightened Edith, though she still tried to keep a brave face. Reverend Carter and his wife arrived and were trying to comfort and reassure people. When it was time to go on the boats, the Reverend's wife, Lillian, chose to stay with her husband. Edith and Elizabeth were being pushed forward, even as Elizabeth was weeping and yelled for Thomas to get on the boat. At this point, Edith could no longer hold back her tears, and they began streaming silently down her cheeks. Thomas stood quietly, gently puffing his cigar, never taking his eyes off his two girls. As lifeboat number 14 was lowered down, Edith screamed out to him, "Do what Mother says, please, Father. Find another boat." Thomas gave them both a little wave and blew them a kiss. He leaned over the railing and shouted down to them, "I'll see you in New York." That was the last time that Edith would ever see her father. The band had switched to playing hymns now, and it wasn't long until the music faded and was replaced by shrieks as people on deck raced toward the rising stern in a desperate attempt to gain a few precious moments of life. Edith and her mother put their hands over their ears to block out the sounds of human suffering. As the Titanic broke into two and sank to the bottom of the ocean, the passengers aboard lifeboat number 14 sat in stunned silence for hours, until finally dawn broke, shedding light on the horrific scene around them. As far as the eye could see, there were bodies, gray bodies, many in life vests bobbing in upright positions. There were women and children still clinging to each other, their frozen bodies spread on floating debris and deck chairs that had been tied together. When the rescue ship Carpathia finally arrived, those who were capable climbed a ladder to safety. Their legs were so frozen that they could barely stand due to the lack of feeling. The youngest children were hauled up to the boat in small mail bags. Both Edith and Elizabeth managed to force themselves up the ladder. Every time another lifeboat would come on board, they frantically searched for Thomas. All of the survivors searched frantically for their loved ones. Edith and Elizabeth held out hope that they would be reunited with Thomas in New York, each encouraging the other to hold on to hope, but in their hearts they knew he was gone. Everyone on board the Carpathia was grieving. They had all lost someone. Yet, even in their grief, they were so grateful for the compassion the Carpathia's passengers and crew showed the survivors of the Titanic. Passengers donated them clothes and even turned over their own cabins for them to sleep in. From the poorest third-class passengers to the wealthiest first class, they were all shown equal compassion and care. Before they reached New York, Elizabeth confided in Edith that even if by some miracle Thomas had survived, they would still be broke. Everything they owned had sunk with the Titanic. But they did have the money in their coats, and they could go and stay with Aunt Josephine and live off that money until they got back on their feet. When the survivors arrived in New York, they were met by thousands of spectators and relatives. Reporters and photographers squeezed through the crowd, firing questions at the shell-shocked passengers as they unloaded. Did you see dead bodies? Did you lose all your money? How did you survive? The first-class passengers left first and were whisked away on taxis or private limousines. Next came Edith and Elizabeth with the rest of the second-class passengers. They were taken to a hostel where they were given a hot bath and hoped against hope that there would be news that someone else had survived. The next day brought no reports of any more survivors. Elizabeth told Edith, "It's just you and me now." Thomas's body was never recovered. The Reverend and his wife's bodies were never recovered. Edith and Elizabeth did not stay long in Seattle before returning to South Africa, where they were relieved to discover that Thomas had left them various stocks and bonds worth enough money for them to live comfortably on. Elizabeth eventually remarried, and unfortunately, Edith did not get along with her new stepfather, and so she moved in with family friends. In 1917, at the age of 20, she got married, and together they had 10 children and were married for 60 years until her husband's death in 1977. 10 years later, when more than 2,000 items were retrieved from the wreckage of the Titanic, what is believed to be Thomas's gold watch was found in a Gladstone bag along with $60,000, all of which was claimed by the salvage company. Edith lived to be 100 years old and left behind 40 grandchildren and great-grandchildren, even outliving 4 of her own children. She was the survivor who had lived to be the oldest. 5 months before her death, she traveled to the site of the sinking as part of a memorial expedition and dropped a wreath onto the water. Edith wept as she had finally completed her lifelong mission of giving her father a proper farewell. Willie Coots and the friends he had made aboard the Titanic didn't mind that some of the areas of the ships were off limits to them. What did 9-year-old little boys need with fancy saunas and music recitals when they had access to explore the steamy engine room? And what kid wanted to eat lobster when they were served some pretty delicious corned beef, rabbit, steak, soups, and puddings right there in third class? Willie was on the adventure of a lifetime. He was traveling with his mother, Minnie, and 3-year-old little brother to meet his father, who was waiting for them in Brooklyn. His father had sent money for them to get second-class tickets, but Minnie had decided that third-class cabin was perfectly acceptable, and the money she saved would be better spent towards their new home in America. On the night of the tragedy, when Minnie was stepping to the lifeboat, one of the crewmen held her 3-year-old, who they tossed into the boat after her. Willie then went to follow his mother into the boat when an officer stopped him with a hand on his chest. "Where do you think you're going?" he said to Willie. "I'm getting on the boat with my mother and my brother." "Children only," the officer growled. "But he is a child," Minnie cried. "Let him in." "He looks too old." "I'm only 9, Willie said. "Willie," Minnie said, "take off your hat and let the man see that you're just a child." Willie removed his hat to reveal a freckled-faced, red-haired little boy. "All right," the officer said. "Get in. That hat of yours makes you look older." He was 9. How old could a 9-year-old really have looked? Willie witnessed one man who left his wife saying that he would be less of a man if he were to get on the lifeboat, so he must stay behind. The officer then barked at other men who were attempting to join their wives on the lifeboat, and the boat, that had room for at least a dozen more passengers, was lowered down. One of the men broke from the group of men who were watching their families go down without them and jumped off the side of the ship and into the boat with his family. I mean, honestly, they should all have done that. There was room. Only one of the other little boys that Willie had spent his time playing with survived. The rest and their families perished that night. Once in America, Willie, his mother, and his brother were all reunited with his father. They never cared to speak publicly about the tragedy. Willie grew up to marry and have 2 daughters. He was a professional musician until he died of a heart attack at the age of 55. After being sent back to her room to grab blankets for the evacuation, 12-year-old Ruth Becker became separated from her mother and placed on a different lifeboat. She was terrified, but she was comforted with the fact that she had seen her mother and her siblings get onto another lifeboat. So she just did her best to be brave and help those around her. Noticing that the crewmen were in sleeveless shirts and shorts with no protection against the frigid night air, Ruth began cutting up the blankets and passing them around. Sitting next to her was an 18-year-old woman who was sobbing uncontrollably. Ruth tried to console her, but had a hard time understanding because of her thick Polish accent that was made much worse by the weeping. When she was finally able to calm down a bit, Ruth understood that the woman's name was Leah, and she was frantic because she had lost her 10-month-old son, Frank Phillip, whom she called Philly. Leah and her son had been traveling as third-class passengers on their way to America to meet her husband. When Leah was told it was time to evacuate, she had wrapped Philly in a blanket to keep him warm and went up on deck. Passengers were pushing and shoving to get into the lifeboats, and in the chaos, Philly was knocked from her arms. It happened so quickly that she didn't see what happened. She asked others to help her in a frantic search to find her baby, but summarized that in the chaos, he must have been kicked overboard. "My poor little Philly is dead," she wept. Throughout the night, Ruth tried to encourage Leah to hold on to hope, but Leah didn't know how it was possible that he could have made it. Once on board the Carpathia, Ruth and Leah went in search of little Philly. They were interrupted by someone who told Ruth her mother was on board and had been frantically searching for her daughter. Ruth left the distraught Leah in order to go and be reunited with her own mother, who had also spent the night weeping for her lost child. Meanwhile, Leah continued her frantic search until she heard a baby's cry. She knew that cry. It was her Philly. A woman was holding the baby when she saw Leah, and he reached out for her. "That's my baby," Leah cried. "How do I know he's yours?" the woman exclaimed, clutching Philly closer to her chest. Leah was so shocked that her baby was just not immediately returned to her that she burst into tears and started babbling, and as emotional as she was, her accent was so thick that no one could understand her English. Finally, another woman intervened and took them both to see the captain. The woman who had Philly explained that she'd been sitting in a lifeboat whenever a crewman had tossed her a bundle of what she thought was just a rolled-up blanket. But then she had heard crying and realized that she was holding a baby. She had kept the baby warm under her nightcoat all night in the lifeboat until the Carpathia arrived and the baby was hoisted up on deck in a mail bag. Once on board, she had just pretended that the baby belonged to her and no one had questioned her. The woman told the captain, "I believe that God sent me this baby because it was an orphan." Leah, however, continued to insist that Philly was her own flesh and blood, and so the captain asked if the baby had any physical characteristics that she could use to prove that she was in fact his mother. Leah responded that her baby had a cherry birthmark on his chest. Unwrapping the baby, the captain confirmed that the baby did indeed have a birthmark. "Here's your son," he said as he headed the baby back off to Leah. When Leah saw Ruth again, she explained that Philly had been in lifeboat number 11 all along. Ruth shook her head in disbelief. That was the same boat her family had been on. "From now on, 11 will be our lucky number." Ruth and her family continued their journey and were reunited with her father the following year. She finished high school, went to college, and then was married and raised 3 children. Ruth refused to talk about the Titanic for many years. Not even her own children knew that she was a survivor until they were older. Finally, after she retired in 1971, she started granting interviews and attending the Titanic Historical Society conventions. Ruth lived to be 90 years old. Leah and her son Philly were reunited with her husband Sam, and they lived in Virginia together. Leah was forever grateful to the Carpathia and its captain for returning her son to her. When she had a daughter, she named her Sarah Carpathia. But because of a miscommunication at the hospital, the baby girl's name on the birth certificate initially read Sarah Titanic. Leah and Sam went on to have another son named Henry. Philly became known as the Titanic baby in the press. When he was a teenager, he joined his father in his scrap metal business, which he eventually took over. He got married, raised a family, and was known to collect Titanic mementos and attended several survivor conventions. He died in 1990 at the age of 80. The clothes he was wrapped in remained in the family's possession until they were put on display at the Mariners Museum in Virginia. Now, the youngest of all the passengers to survive was Malvina Dean. She was just 9 weeks old. She was a third-class passenger and was traveling with her mother, father, and 1-year-old brother. They had sold everything and they were planning to open a shop in America. Once Malvina, her mother, and her brother made it onto the Carpathia, there was a long line of people who wanted to hold the Titanic's miracle baby. Her father, like most of the other men, didn't make it, and so many drew hope from the fact that this tiny baby had made it out safely. Now, it was such a ruckus, and there was such a long line of people waiting to hold this baby that the captain came out and told each person that only hold the baby for 10 minutes, and then they needed to pass the baby along to someone else. Malvina never married or had children, but she lived a long and happy life and enjoyed being around children. When she was elderly and needed nursing care, she couldn't afford the steep bills, and so she decided that she was going to start selling some of her Titanic artifacts to pay the bill. But word got to the director of the 1997 film Titanic and the actors who were in the movie, Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, and also Celine Dion, who had the song that was featured in the film. And they all said, no. We have to take care of this. And so they stepped in and they paid her nursing home bills and made sure that she was taken care of until her death at 97 years old. She was the youngest to be rescued, and ultimately she ended up being the last living survivor from the Titanic. Now, as we've discussed all throughout this episode, the evacuation of the Titanic was extremely chaotic, and many of the young children were kept calm by their parents or nurses who told them that it was going to be okay. They were simply going to go for a ride to see the stars. Some of the children even fell back asleep in their caregivers' arms and slept through the entire ordeal on the lifeboats and into the next morning. Now, the thing that gets me the most about this is every time I read about how the young men and boys were turned away from lifeboats that still had room on them, like that's the part that I can't understand. I mean, I've always heard this throughout the years, but I always just assumed they were in a rush. That's why the boats were half empty. But I didn't realize that there were some men standing there that could have been loaded onto the boats, and they were just turned away at gunpoint whenever, the boat could have held another 10 or 20 people even. It just seems so senseless to me. Now, the few male passengers who did manage to jump into a half-empty lifeboat at the last minute, or who were given a place because they needed an extra set of hands to row the boats or something like that, they were highly scrutinized by the public. They were accused of being cowards, of taking the place on boats that should have been reserved for women and children. I read the story of one family that was so glad they had all survived, and the only reason the father from the family survived is because as one of the half-empty lifeboats was being lowered down, he was one of the ones that jumped into the boat because it's there's room for, why, why am I not going? When they got back, though, they were shunned from society. The whole family was, due to the husband's supposed cowardliness in surviving. His wife, who was initially happy that he survived, ended up divorcing him, trying to distance herself from this negative reputation. Fortunately, though, his children stood by him because they knew that their father was no coward and had simply stepped into a half-empty boat as it was being lowered into the water. Many of the children survivors looked back in awe at their last interactions with their fathers, noting how calm and reassuring they were, even as they knew that they were about to die.